Hello, I'm David Morris. We're living in polarising times. The re-election of Donald Trump has people polarised. You either love him or you hate him. We're polarised about China, about technology, about the climate, and I've written about all of these things in my book, A New Era of Risk. But today I thought I would talk specifically about what happened a decade or so ago, what happened in particular with the first election of Donald Trump and the beginning of this new polarisation around China. Now, if we go back a decade or more before Donald Trump was elected the first time, the world was in the middle of globalisation, this process that had brought China to the fore as a supplier to world markets. American, European and other companies had all moved into China to take advantage of low costs, to take advantage of a business environment that was very competitive. And so China, just like other East Asian economies before it, had become central to globalisation. Also at the same time, a couple of decades ago, we had an emerging unhappiness, an emerging anxiety in Western countries, in particular the United States and in Europe. So there were things that were going on domestically in those places that were influencing a growing dissatisfaction. So there was actually an internal polarisation occurring because of a failed economic policy, an economic policy in Europe and America that was leading to the decline of the middle class, the decline of manufacturing and a less competitive economy when faced with the more competitive economies of Asia. So instead of trying to resolve the economic competitiveness problems that the US and Europe had, there became an increasing view that it was easier to blame China. And so we saw Donald Trump elected 8 years ago on a wave of anti-China messaging, letting people think that if we could just slap tariffs on Chinese products, have a trade war with China, that would solve our domestic economic problems. Well, of course, things aren't that easy. Large parts of the United States economy are just simply not competitive. We know today there's still a huge trade deficit that the United States runs with China. Equally, for Europe as well, the same trend was occurring at the time that Donald Trump was elected. Within Europe itself, we were seeing the rise of populist leaders, the discussion about blaming outsiders for Europe's internal problems. Now, I want to pause for a moment and just emphasise that the domestic problems are worth considering when we're talking about the international environment. Even talking about China, we have to understand that Europe in the first couple of decades of this century was totally internally focused on many of the failures of its own European Union regional integration project. And I don't say that happily, because I think the European Union project is a very worthy project. Actually, it's the one thing that has kept peace in Europe until the recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But peace within most of Europe has been secured for a long time by the European integration process. But there were problems, there were tensions, and in particular there were real failures to develop, to keep developing, to keep innovating a competitive economy in Europe. So the European Union, the way it's been managed for a long time, has been focused on ideology more than actual pragmatic economic competitiveness in the world, and that was starting to hurt Europeans. So middle-class Europeans were starting to hurt, and the same, perhaps more familiar, was that the same thing was happening in the United States, where 1% of the population was getting richer and richer as a result of neoliberal economic policy, and many middle-class people were feeling left behind, were starting to feel resentful even of new arrivals. So you had all of that tension already in the US and in Europe. But what happened, while the US in its global international relations was focused on the Middle East, fighting wars in the Middle East, which all turned out to be pretty unsuccessful, while Europe was focused internally on its own problems internally, China was rising. And so it almost wasn't noticed in the United States and Europe when China became the second largest economy, when it became the world's largest trading power, when it overtook Germany to become the biggest trading country in the world, and when it overtook Japan to become the second biggest economy in the world. It almost took the global financial crisis and the deep political problems that emerged in the United States and Europe as a result of that financial crisis that led to what I would call the demonization of China. China's not perfect. We could talk about all the flaws of China, but in terms of understanding how the West started to demonize China, I think that background is important. It all happened before the rise of Donald Trump, but Trump came along and took advantage of all of that. He took advantage of the fact that people in America were hurting. People were feeling like their industries were declining, jobs were disappearing, and they were going to Walmart and shopping and seeing that everything said made in China. So rather like back in the 1970s when people were discovering everything said made in Japan, and when people got quite angry with Japan and quite protectionist, and the United States, of course, took some significant measures to force Japan to adjust and to change. Well, the United States found itself in the same position with China just at the time that Trump was elected the first time. So he's elected promising a trade war, saying that tariffs are the most beautiful thing, tariffs against Chinese products will solve this problem. Well, it wasn't that easy. It didn't work. But let's have a look at what did work and what didn't work. So firstly, in terms of economics, it certainly doesn't work, because any economist will tell you that it is far better to focus on your own internal competitiveness and to be open to the outside world. Being open to the outside world forces you to become more competitive, to find those industries that you are strong in. The United States is certainly very strong in many industries, so the United States should not be afraid of competition with other countries. And in fact, the United States has been the champion of free trade. It was the champion of globalization until recently. China, however, as it emerged and as it grew, has increasingly become a champion of free trade and of globalization itself, notwithstanding its own domestic subsidies and its own domestic system that, of course, creates some distortions and is not as simplistically described as simply free trade. It's more complex than that. But in the international environment, China has become the advocate for free trade that the United States used to be. So in terms of economics, well, it didn't work for Donald Trump. The trade deficit that the United States still runs today is still hugely significant, and Chinese goods are still flooding into the United States despite the tariffs. Trump, of course, has been re-elected a few weeks ago, threatening even higher tariffs. Let's see what that does. It will certainly add to inflation. It will certainly distort international markets and create real difficulties all around the world, potentially. I doubt that it's going to lead to some American economic nirvana. So in terms of economic policy, the trade war was madness, and most economists will tell you that. But it became something else. So Trump failed in the economics of it, but you have to hand it to him. He succeeded in demonizing China. So the United States in the first Trump administration went into a frenzy of narratives, a frenzy of media, soft power, influence around the world, think tanks well funded by the US government and others telling us all the flaws of the Chinese system. And there are. I'm not here to say China's perfect, but the discussion about China turned from one that was pragmatic and looking at, well, what are the benefits of trading with China and dealing with China, but what are the pitfalls and what are the complications and what are the risks? The discussion shifted to one that demonized China as bad in every respect. And so the narrative that we now read in the media, especially American-sourced, but increasingly European-sourced media as well, and of course here in Australia for a time, we saw the Australian media go into a frenzy as well of anti-China hysteria. And this, I would have to say, was a great success for Donald Trump, because if Donald Trump set out to get the hairs running, to get people afraid of China, to get people blaming and fearing and putting all the negative onto China and all the positive onto America, well, in a sense, Donald Trump succeeded in that. He succeeded so much that actually Joe Biden doubled down on it, and that Joe Biden continued with the tariffs. He actually invested in more economic measures to restrict China's rise, to try and prevent China from getting access to advanced technology. And in terms of the foreign policy discussion, the security discussion, everything's been securitized now. So everything that comes from China is seen as a risk, whether we're talking about electric vehicles, in which China is leading the world, 5G communications technology, in which China also led the world. We saw the banning of Huawei. We have seen a series of economic coercion measures against China which demonize China as a threat, instead of actually having a pragmatic discussion about technology and how do we build rules around technology, how do we actually deal with the rise of these new technologies. But building rules would require cooperation. It would require having a civil and diplomatic and pragmatic relationship with China, which has not been the strategy for the last 8 years. The last 8 years has been about demonizing China. So it's a really problematical question because Donald Trump has succeeded in something, in actually creating almost a bipartisan American and almost a bipartisan European approach to China now, which is unpicking the positive things that we achieved through that globalization period, through the period of peace after the Cold War, the period in which we put in place the World Trade Organization, all these rules around trade and norms around freer and freer trade. That actually benefited a lot of countries, including my own, including Australia. It was enormously beneficial to have that free trade. But we now see the United States and Europe in particular unwinding this. We see the United States really not cooperating with the system of international rules around trade, around norms around technology, for example, but creating this very anti-China sentiment. I argue this is not helpful. I think we need to have a discussion about where there are risks and where there are threats. And in terms of international relations, as a power becomes more powerful, as a country rises, as it builds its defences, etc., we should of course talk about real risks and real areas where we have differences of opinion. But to just demonise one country, so for example to demonise electric vehicles just because they're Chinese, when the world is facing a climate crisis and needs to transition into greener technologies, we cannot do that without China. We actually need China in the tent. We need to be working with China on these big challenges in the global economy and, of course, in dealing with climate and other global common challenges. So Donald Trump, not so successful on the economics of the trade war with China. He may go back again now in his second term to an even greater trade war. He's threatening 60% tariffs. I doubt it. I think it's a negotiating tactic. But actually he was very successful in setting the tone of the narrative. And so many people are afraid to speak up against this narrative. I'm putting my hand up and saying, look, I think we've gone too far. I think the demonising of any country, unless there's a real reason, unless that country is absolutely, if we've got evidence to demonstrate that country is on a plan to dominate the world and to ride roughshod over everyone else's interests, unless we've got that evidence, demonisation doesn't help. Deal with specific problems, and there will be, and there are. Deal with them based on evidence would be my plea. In normal times, we would be able to have discussions about specific disagreements. But we're not in normal times. We're in a time of polarization and we're in a time of demonization. I'll talk more about other aspects of this later, but that, I think, is one of the central questions as we face the next 4 years. How is Donald Trump going to deal with China? He might surprise us and he might do some kind of deal. One final thought to leave with you is that I think this time around China is in a much stronger position, actually. Their economy is weak. Their economy is struggling at the moment. They're going through a very difficult transition period. But China is prepared for Trump this time, I think. I think they've done the homework, they've given it the preparation, and they're ready to respond to whatever Donald Trump throws at them. And so that's kind of dangerous too, in a sense, because we're not just dealing with a freak occurrence, we're dealing with a new, coherent strategy that the United States has to take on China. And China, I think, has developed its own coherent strategy, although China's a more closed society and it's hard for us to entirely understand what that strategy is, but I believe China also has its own coherent strategy to deal with a United States that is opposed to it, that is going to try and block it in every way. And I'll talk another time about how China is investing in its relationships across the developing world. It's building a complete set of new partners, a new set of economic partners, and it's building its resilience and its ability to survive without United States trade, which I think is kind of disappointing, in fact very alarming for the state of the world that we're heading into. We're heading into a world of more conflict, more confrontation, and we need a bit of calm, reasoned discussion. There are specific problems, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.